In Heidegger's phrase, Nietzsche is a human still working with the Western tradition, which views the human being as an animal which has access to itself. So we're trying to think of give more determination and also think more closely about what Heidegger says happened over the course of Western history, which is the move from the determination of the human being as the rational animal to that of the subjective animal. I noticed in the last video I made the lapsus, the Freudian lapsus, as it were, of saying not useless mindfulness, but I said useless mindlessness, as though I was speaking of a Zen practice. And I believe that was the return of the repressed, as it were, because I was just reading the 1955 letter of Jaspers, where Jaspers is desperately pleading with Heidegger to give up this, in effect, give up the mystical nonsense and come back to us to the political realities. But then Jaspers also makes a nod. Jaspers is very generous in all his dealings with Heidegger. He was older than Heidegger. They were very close friends for the longest time. And he says, when you go back and read, and he's also extremely fond of Jacob Burckhardt, and he speaks of Burckhardt bringing him into the same era as with Nietzsche. He says, if you go back to Burckhardt tried to persuade the Swiss that they were Germans, but that this could no longer be understood, and Burckhardt saw that after 1848, so after the time when the nationalist projects were growing, and this beautiful lead, Deutschland über alles, was coined, but it didn't have at all the inflection of the Hitlerzeit, but rather what it meant was over all the divided parts of the fatherland, of the Grand Dukes and all the almost 100 states of Germany should put aside their petty goals and all unify under one Germany, the state project. So in thinking of this as a rise in awareness of things, we see these three categories Nietzsche's making here in the first section of his book, where he still speaks of the historical men, the historian mention, which one part of them I think is like the Steven Pinker part, which are the last men, which are sort of the we call them the people that still believe in enlightenment in this strict sort of there's even in California there's something called the rationalist subculture, something like that. It's like people who suppose themselves to be more calm because they're more scientific and things like this. They can discuss everything without a big passionate fuss or whatnot. In the tradition, let's start from the tradition. What was the rational essence in the tradition? It wasn't mainly, Plato was very concerned with the rule of families. I think that was one of the greatest impetuses for many of his more political dialogues, is that the rule of families creates what you call interest politics, and that people have an interest that's contrary to reason. Reason is then contrasted with interest. So how far, when we come to the point of the radical point of reason becoming subjectivity, what happens? You can so it's not that reason is contrasted with emotion, as you might think, because for instance, if something is unjust, we're right to be outraged about it. So the question would then be, say from the Catholic point of view, the question would that the Catholics has at one point in the Western tradition along the way to the position we're at now, the question would then be, is that outrage reasonable? It's not that emotion is ruled out, it's just whether the emotion is reasonable or not. We have So I want to get to this Ukraine example, but I'm thinking of oh yeah, let's go through the 3 points. So there's the historical men that are sort of still muttering along. They're not quite conscious of what's going on. Then there's those that have come to the conclusion that reason is basically worthless because every position along the way, every society you can build is you can't say one is higher than the other. And then sort of the in a more metaphysical form, what the anthropologists would say, what any anthropologist would tell you in American anthropology department or all around the world, really. There's just difference, as Derrida works this out more at a higher altitude, let's say, but there's, this is worked out also at the level of participant observation, carried out studies by anthropologists, and so there's difference, there's not hierarchy, right? Then there's the third position Nietzsche raises, which are the sort of like the Übermensch, which are the ones who go in the direction of the life-giving why. So they say, yeah, that's true. There is reason doesn't really ever get you there. There's other reasons we have to think of why reason is failing us in the strictly the other main thing is the theme would be why is science not the truth? So that would get you into these questions of whether science is genuinely an improvement over the philosophy as it were before the so-called hard sciences became the definition of science, and questions along those lines. Nietzsche's man who says, I'm for life, even though I believe I'm for the life-giving lie, because the truth is deadly, proposes himself to be totally conscious of the questions, but to choose this path. So then I want to ask, how conscious are we in general as political actors that are today? So for instance, I think of, and in the university too, so what's happening in the university when you have the general accusation of ideological control of the department? So for instance, recently a scholar called Jennifer Pitts has put out a book on the international, on the conceptions of the international, and it was praised by Samuel Moyn, who is a great, who was a reader of Leo Strauss, and who was a student of the concept of dignity. And he said, he gave, in his typical sort of arch style, he said, this is the finest book yet written in this discipline. So, by which he meant to say that he meant to praise her as founding a new discipline. So you might think that the conception of the international is an old field of study, but they're claiming that Jennifer Pitts has written the first major book about it, bringing into her thought these people like D. Vattel and W. Du Bois and some others, conceptions of the international. And then at the same time, he's saying, it's a sort of a non-insult insult in that it's the finest book, but it's the only one, of course. But so if you look at what she's doing there, you get the sense that there's a kind of, I'll just gloss it by saying sort of Edward Said slant, and then you can see that there's this work of the profession. So she's basically, if you put it in an analogy with the Prussian professional historians which are working for the House of Hohenzollern, and said she is working for a certain kind of idea, and then you have the kind of ideology defined in the simplest, not in this kind of Zizek sense, but defined in the simplest sense as the contrast between gathering data or facts, but under the principle of some importance. You have some way to sift out your facts because you think some facts are important, some aren't. And you can see the way these fields are forming up because of things that people think are important, because they have more or less consciously political projects. But then they can very well say, nonetheless, we have all these standards of gathering data according to something that's more or less vaguely reminds of the classicist standard of the close reading, but in a field of history where you're gathering data from the books written in the past, but also from history understood empirically. So then, how conscious are these people of the choice of what they're doing? They're sort of more in the direction of the historian mentioned, right? The historical people, I would say. Now then you get over to if you think of the project of Ukraine, but there's not enough time to discuss it yet. But I want to say the first step would be, so how conscious are the people, how much is this, which is then passes for reason, simply a matter of interest? So if we only have interest, this seems to be what it's meant by reason becoming subjectivity. There's no way to distinguish reason from interest anymore. I mean, in the crude sense, interest would be an example like, say, not going into phage therapy studies, even though in the 1920s or so it was known that phage therapy was a good strategy because the chemical corporations wrote some papers and said chemotherapy is the way to go, and then everything goes in that direction and you suppress something that could have been very useful, and then hundreds of thousands of people die because of the excess of chemical therapies, which are basically just killing the body with chemicals instead of the phage therapy, which is using bacteria and other parts of the body to a beneficial practice. That may be a slightly controversial example. More obvious would be the tobacco companies' interest in suppressing the view that tobacco is cancer causing. But you can see what interest means, and in Plato's sense, interest means families have their own thing, and they're in contest with the rest of the people and in the community, and therefore the community gets the short end of the stick. But then in the 18th century and onward, that's interpreted differently in order to say this sort of egotism, this sort of contest leads to the things Mandeville talked about, and this has worked out you can see it most clearly in George Berkeley's arguments, which were read by the Queen and others and very influential, that show the discussions at the level of sort of a cafe discussion, prolonged but very high cafe discussion, let's say, how people really talked about the issues in the 18th century. Then you see the arguments for the rise of the commercial values and for the rise of the idea of the rational self-interest, as it was later glossed. But egotism leads to the good of the whole. But this idea is very recent. So you see that the reason is undergoing all this pummeling and ends up becoming subjectivity. So let's go on to that. Next time I want to go more into the Ukraine issue.